The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of Le Bernardin, as every eye in the restaurant turned toward our table. My husband Marcus stood frozen, his hand still resting possessively on the small of another woman's back, his mouth forming silent words that would never be enough to explain this moment. The woman beside him, tall and elegant in an emerald dress I'd never seen before, looked at me with something that might have been pity or triumph. I couldn't tell which was worse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Happy anniversary, darling, I whispered, my voice carrying across the stunned silence of New York's most exclusive dining room, and what happened next would change everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my strength, and the woman I was about to become. The morning of our 10th wedding anniversary started like any other Tuesday in my carefully orchestrated life. I woke at 5:30 to the gentle hum of our penthouse's climate control system, the Manhattan skyline gradually lightening beyond our floor-to-ceiling windows. Marcus was already gone, his side of our California king bed cold and precisely made, hospital corners that would have impressed his military father. A note lay on his pillow, written in the elegant script that had first caught my attention at Columbia Law School 20 years ago. Sarah, dinner tonight at 8. Le Bernardin. Wear the blue Valentino. Have something special planned. Love, M. I held the cream-colored stationery embossed with his firm's letterhead and felt that familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with something else I couldn't quite name. 10 years of marriage, 12 years together, and Marcus still had the power to surprise me. At 38, I'd learned to appreciate the small gestures, the thoughtful details that showed he was thinking of me, despite his demanding schedule as a senior partner at Coleman, Wright Associates. I pressed the note to my chest, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne that still lingered on the paper. Tonight would be perfect. Le Bernardin had been the site of our first real date, back when Marcus was a struggling associate, and I was finishing my master's degree in art therapy. He'd saved for months to afford that dinner, arriving nervous and slightly rumpled in a suit that didn't quite fit. Now, a decade later, he could afford to dine there weekly if he chose, though we rarely did. The gesture felt significant, intentional. After my morning yoga routine on the terrace overlooking Central Park, I called my sister Emma from the kitchen while preparing my usual breakfast of steel-cut oats and fresh berries. Emma lived in Portland with her photographer husband and 2 teenagers, a life that seemed simultaneously chaotic and enviable from my structured Manhattan existence. 10 years, Emma mused when I told her about the dinner plans. Remember when you thought you'd never get married? Miss Independent Career Woman who swore she'd never need a man to complete her? I laughed, remembering that version of myself with something approaching fondness. People change. Marcus helped me see that partnership doesn't mean losing yourself. And you've been happy? Really happy? The question caught me off guard. Emma had always been direct, sometimes brutally so, but there was something in her tone that suggested more than casual sisterly interest. Of course I'm happy, I replied automatically. Why would you ask that? I don't know. Lately when we talk you sound different, more careful, like you're editing yourself. I stirred my oats thoughtfully, considering her observation. It was true that our conversations had become more surface level in recent years, focused on safe topics like her children's activities, or my volunteer work with the Metropolitan Museum's education programs. When had I stopped sharing the intimate details of my marriage? The small frustrations and daily joys that sisters typically discuss. Things have been stressful with his promotion to senior partner, I offered. We're both adjusting to the new demands on his time. Sarah, Emma said gently, when was the last time you and Marcus took a vacation together? Just the 2 of you? The question required more thought than it should have. Last summer we went to Martha's Vineyard with the Colemans. That's not what I meant, and you know it. A real vacation. No business contacts, no networking dinners, no checking emails every 5 minutes. I couldn't remember. Our travels in recent years had indeed been tethered to Marcus's professional obligations. Golf weekends with clients or charity galas in various cities, where his firm had offices. Even our honeymoon in Tuscany had been cut short when a major case required his attention. Tonight will be different, I said, more to convince myself than Emma. He specifically said he has something special planned. After we ended the call, I found myself wandering through our penthouse with new eyes, noting details I'd somehow stopped seeing. The living room showcased Marcus's taste exclusively, all clean lines and expensive neutrals. The art carefully selected by his interior designer for maximum impact on clients. My own touches had been gradually edited out over the years, relegated to my small home office or the guest bedroom that no guests ever used. I paused before the built-in bookshelf that dominated one wall, running my fingers along the spines of legal journals and business biographies. Where were my books? The art therapy texts, the psychology journals, the novels I'd once devoured voraciously. I found them finally, on the lowest shelf, dusty from neglect. When had I stopped reading for pleasure? When had my interests become so secondary that they literally occupied the bottom shelf of our shared space? Shaking off these unsettling observations, I focused on the evening ahead. Marcus had requested the blue Valentino, a stunning piece I'd purchased for a charity gala 6 months earlier but never worn. He'd been called away on business the night of the event, leaving me to attend alone and field well-meaning questions about his absence. Tonight would redeem that disappointment. I spent the afternoon at my favorite spa in Soho, indulging in a massage and facial that left my skin glowing. The manicurist painted my nails in a subtle pink that complemented the dress, and the stylist arranged my honey blonde hair in an elegant updo that showcased the diamond earrings Marcus had given me for our 5th anniversary. By 6 o'clock, I was transformed. The Valentino fit like it had been designed specifically for my body, the midnight blue fabric catching the light as I moved. The dress was sophisticated yet feminine, classic yet modern. I looked like the wife of a successful Manhattan attorney, polished and appropriate. Marcus texted at 6:30. Running late. Meet me at the restaurant. Table is reserved under my name. Can't wait to see you. A flicker of disappointment crossed my mind. In our early years, he would have insisted on picking me up personally, making our anniversary dinner feel like a formal date. But senior partnership came with demands, I reminded myself. The important thing was that we were celebrating together. I arrived at Le Bernardin 15 minutes early, wanting to ensure everything was perfect. The maitre d' recognized me immediately, his face lighting up with professional warmth. Mrs. Richardson, how lovely to see you again. Your husband called to confirm your anniversary reservation. We have your table ready. He led me through the elegant dining room to a prime table with views of the kitchen, where world-renowned chefs moved with choreographed precision. The table was set for 3. I think there might be a mistake, I said, noting the extra place setting. It should just be 2 tonight. The maitre d' consulted his reservation book, his expression momentarily confused. Mr. Richardson specifically requested a table for 3 when he called this afternoon. Perhaps you're expecting another guest? I shook my head, equally puzzled. No, it's just our anniversary dinner. Could we possibly remove the 3rd setting? Of course, madam. My apologies for the confusion. As the server discreetly removed the extra place setting, I tried to dismiss a growing sense of unease. Marcus was nothing if not meticulous about details. He didn't make reservation mistakes. Perhaps he'd planned a surprise, a mutual friend joining us for dessert to extend our celebration. By 8:15, I was nursing my 2nd glass of champagne and fielding sympathetic looks from the waitstaff. Marcus's lateness wasn't unusual, but the timing felt particularly pointed tonight. I texted him twice, receiving no response, and was beginning to consider leaving when I saw him enter the restaurant. Relief flooded through me until I noticed he wasn't alone. A woman walked beside him, her hand resting casually on his arm as he spoke to the maitre d'. She was stunning in the way that Manhattan seemed to produce effortlessly, tall and willowy with auburn hair that caught the restaurant's warm lighting. Her black dress was simple but clearly expensive, the kind of understated elegance that whispered rather than shouted wealth. I watched them approach, confusion clouding my initial relief. Perhaps she was a client, someone whose presence at our anniversary dinner related to the special surprise Marcus had mentioned. But as they drew closer, I noticed the intimacy of their body language, the way she leaned slightly into him as they walked, the casual possessiveness of her touch. Marcus reached our table first, his expression unreadable as he leaned down to kiss my cheek. His lips felt cool against my skin, perfunctory. Sarah, you look beautiful. Sorry, I'm late. I'd like you to meet someone. The woman stepped forward, her smile confident and slightly predatory. You must be Sarah. I'm Victoria Chen. I've heard so much about you. I remained seated, my training in social graces warring with an instinct I couldn't quite name. Something about Victoria's tone, the way she said my name, the proprietary glance she cast toward Marcus, sent warning signals through my nervous system. Nice to meet you, I managed, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Are you joining us for dinner? Actually, Marcus said, settling into his chair across from me while Victoria took the seat to his right. Victoria and I have something to tell you. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to recede, conversations and clinking silverware fading into background static. I noticed irrelevant details with sharp clarity. The way the candlelight caught the gold threads in Victoria's dress, the slight tremor in Marcus's hand as he reached for his water glass, the concerned expression on our server's face as he approached our table. Tell me what? I asked, though some part of me already knew had perhaps known for longer than I cared to admit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus glanced at Victoria, who nodded almost imperceptibly. The exchange was intimate, practiced, the kind of wordless communication that develops between people who've shared secrets and decisions. Sarah, Marcus began, his lawyer's voice emerging, measured and careful. Victoria and I have been seeing each other for the past 18 months. What started as a professional relationship has developed into something more significant. The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable landing with deliberate precision. 18 months. A year and a half of my life, of our marriage, built on a foundation I hadn't known, was crumbling beneath my feet. Professional relationship? I repeated, my voice strangely calm despite the chaos in my chest. Victoria is the Chief Marketing Officer at Brennan & Associates, Marcus explained, referring to the advertising firm his company often worked with. We've been collaborating on the Henderson merger campaign. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her expression what might have been intended as sympathetic but registered as condescending. Sarah, I want you to know that neither of us planned for this to happen. Sometimes these things just evolve naturally between people who share common goals and interests. I stared at her, this woman who spoke about destroying my marriage as if discussing market trends or weather patterns. Her casual use of my name, as if we were old friends discussing a mutual acquaintance, felt like another violation. 18 months, I said again, the timeline sinking in with horrifying clarity. The Henderson merger started 2 years ago. Marcus had the grace to look uncomfortable, his confident demeanor cracking slightly. Yes, well, these things developed gradually. My mind raced backward through the past 18 months, reinterpreting memories with this new information. The late nights that had become more frequent, the business trips that seemed to extend beyond their original timelines, the gradual cooling of our physical relationship that I'd attributed to stress and age. The phone calls he'd started taking in his office with the door closed, conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. How long have you been planning to tell me? I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Marcus and Victoria exchanged another glance, and I realized with a sick clarity that this dinner, this public revelation in our anniversary restaurant, had been choreographed. They'd discussed how to handle me, when to reveal their relationship, probably how to minimize the professional and social complications of their affair. We wanted to wait until the Henderson case was concluded, Marcus said. But Victoria has received an offer to head the marketing department at Klein Industries in Los Angeles. It's an incredible opportunity, and I've decided to go with her. The final piece of their plan dropped into place with devastating precision. This wasn't just a confession of infidelity. This was Marcus informing me that he was leaving, that he'd already made plans for a future that didn't include me, plans that had been in motion for longer than I cared to calculate. You're moving to Los Angeles, I said flatly. We're moving to Los Angeles, Victoria corrected gently, reaching across the table to place her manicured hand over Marcus's. The gesture was casual, automatic, the kind of unconscious intimacy that develops between long-term partners. I stared at their joined hands, noting the way their fingers intertwined naturally, the way Victoria's thumb traced small circles on Marcus's knuckle. How many times had I witnessed this same gesture between us becoming mechanical, perfunctory, performed rather than felt? When? I asked. Next month, Marcus replied. I've already submitted my resignation to the firm. They're disappointed, of course, but they understand that sometimes career opportunities require difficult personal decisions. Career opportunities, as if our 10-year marriage was merely a professional obstacle to be overcome. As if the life we'd built together was secondary to Victoria's job offer in California. And you thought our anniversary dinner was the appropriate venue to inform me of these decisions? I asked, my voice gaining strength as anger began to crystallize beneath the shock. Marcus had the decency to look slightly ashamed. I know the timing isn't ideal, but we wanted to be honest with you before finalizing our plans, and this restaurant has significance for us. I thought it might soften the transition. Soften the transition, the clinical language he was using, as if my emotional devastation was merely a logistical challenge to be managed efficiently. Victoria leaned forward again, her expression earnest. Sarah, I hope you can understand that neither of us intended for this to happen. Marcus has spoken about you with such respect and affection. This situation doesn't diminish what you two shared, but sometimes people grow apart. Sometimes they discover compatibility with others that they didn't know was missing from their primary relationship. The patronizing tone, the therapeutic language, the implication that my marriage had been somehow deficient without my knowledge, sent a surge of rage through my system. This woman was sitting in our anniversary restaurant, wearing clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, explaining to me why she had decided to steal my husband as if she were doing me a favor. I looked around the dining room, noting the curious glances from other patrons who had undoubtedly sensed the tension at our table. The servers had given us a wide berth, trained to recognize when guests required privacy for difficult conversations. The maître hovered near the bar, his expression professionally neutral, but his attention clearly focused on our table. Tell me something, Victoria, I said, my voice carrying more clearly than I'd intended. When you decided to pursue a married man, did you consider the impact on his wife, or was that just an inconvenient detail to be handled later? Victoria's composure flickered momentarily, a flash of irritation crossing her features before the sympathetic mask returned. I understand you're upset, and you have every right to be, but Marcus and I didn't set out to hurt anyone. These things happen organically between consenting adults. Consenting adults. As if I had somehow consented to my husband's 18-month deception, as if my exclusion from their decision-making process was irrelevant to the outcome. Marcus cleared his throat, his discomfort with the direction of our conversation evident. Sarah, perhaps we could discuss the practical arrangements privately. There's no need to air our personal matters publicly. I looked at him, this man I'd loved for over a decade, and saw a stranger. When had he become someone who could orchestrate such calculated cruelty? When had his capacity for compartmentalization extended to our marriage itself? Practical arrangements, I repeated. Of course, we wouldn't want to be impractical about the dissolution of our marriage. There's no need for sarcasm, Marcus said, his tone taking on the edge it acquired when he felt his authority was being challenged. We're all adults here. We can handle this situation maturely. Maturely. As if my emotional response to discovering my husband's affair was somehow childish. As if my shock and anger were inappropriate reactions to his betrayal. I reached for my champagne flute, noting absently that my hands were no longer trembling. The initial shock was giving way to something else, a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I looked at Marcus and Victoria, sitting together like a couple already, comfortable in their shared deception, confident in their ability to manage my reaction to their plans. You know what strikes me most about this conversation? I said, my voice gaining strength with each word. It's how thoroughly you've both convinced yourselves that this situation is somehow inevitable, natural, beyond anyone's control. As if Marcus's decision to pursue an affair and your decision to encourage it were just things that happened to you rather than choices you both made deliberately. Victoria's mask slipped further, revealing a flash of genuine annoyance. I think you're oversimplifying a complex emotional situation. Am I? I asked, standing slowly, the movement drawing attention from nearby tables. Because it seems quite simple to me. You wanted something that belonged to someone else, and you took it. Marcus wanted excitement and validation, and he found it outside his marriage. The complexity you're referring to is just the elaborate justification system you've both constructed to avoid acknowledging the basic selfishness of your choices. The dining room had grown noticeably quieter, conversations pausing as other guests registered the drama unfolding at our table. Marcus's face flushed with embarrassment and anger, his professional composure cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. Sarah, please sit down. You're making a scene. I looked down at him, this man who had shared my bed, my dreams, my daily life for 10 years, and felt something shift inside me permanently. The woman who had entered this restaurant an hour ago, nervous and excited about her anniversary dinner, no longer existed. In her place stood someone I didn't recognize but was beginning to respect. You're absolutely right, Marcus. I am making a scene. Because this situation deserves a scene. Because 18 months of lies and deception and calculated betrayal deserves more than a quiet, mature conversation over anniversary dinner. Because your decision to bring your mistress to our anniversary dinner deserves exactly the kind of public acknowledgement you've been so careful to avoid. I reached into my purse and removed the small velvet box I'd placed there earlier, the anniversary gift I'd spent weeks selecting. Inside was a vintage watch, a Patek Philippe I'd found at an estate sale, similar to one Marcus had admired in a magazine months earlier. I placed the box on the table between them. Happy anniversary, darling, I said, my voice carrying across the now silent dining room. I hope you and Victoria enjoy your new life together. I certainly plan to enjoy mine. And with that, I turned and walked toward the restaurant's entrance, my head high, my steps steady, leaving behind the shattered remains of my marriage and the shocked silence of New York's most exclusive dining room. I didn't look back to see Marcus and Victoria's faces, didn't pause to acknowledge the stares and whispers that followed my exit. In the lobby, the maitre d' approached me with something approaching admiration in his eyes. Mrs. Richardson, I do hope everything was satisfactory with your service this evening. I looked at him, this man who had witnessed countless dramas played out in his elegant dining room, and smiled for the first time that evening. Actually, I said, it was exactly what I needed. Outside, the Manhattan evening air felt crisp against my skin as I walked away from Le Bernardin, away from the life I'd built with Marcus, toward whatever came next. My phone buzzed with texts, probably from Marcus attempting damage control, but I didn't check them. For the first time in years, possibly decades, I was walking into uncertainty without a plan, without someone else's expectations guiding my steps. And despite the pain, despite the humiliation, despite the complete upheaval of everything I'd thought I knew about my life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember. I felt free. The morning after my public exit from Le Bernardin, I woke up in my sister Emma's guest bedroom in Portland, Oregon. I had no memory of booking the red-eye flight or packing the single suitcase that now sat open on the vintage oak dresser. The last clear recollection I had was walking out of that restaurant, feeling simultaneously powerful and devastated. Everything between that moment and waking up 3,000 miles away remained a blur of airports, tears, and phone calls that had brought Emma rushing to collect me from PDX at dawn. Sunlight streamed through the gauze curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits celebrating some private victory. I could hear Emma's teenagers getting ready for school downstairs, their voices mixing with the sound of her husband David brewing coffee and preparing lunches. The normalcy of their domestic routine felt both foreign and deeply comforting after the sterile perfection of my Manhattan penthouse. My phone sat silent on the nightstand, its black screen reflecting my puffy eyes and tangled hair. I hadn't checked it since arriving, couldn't bring myself to confront whatever messages Marcus had surely left, whatever explanations or justifications or damage control attempts awaited me. The device felt radioactive, dangerous, capable of pulling me back into a reality I wasn't ready to face. Emma knocked softly before entering with a mug of coffee and a concerned expression that reminded me of our mother. At 35, 3 years younger than me, she had always been the more grounded sister, the one who chose practical love over grand romance, who built her life on sustainable foundations rather than dramatic gestures. "How are you feeling?" she asked, settling into the reading chair beside the window. I considered the question seriously. How was I feeling? The shock from last night had settled into something more complex, a mixture of grief and rage, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Relief. Maybe. The terrifying relief of having a secret revealed, even when the secret wasn't one you knew you were keeping. Like I've been living someone else's life, I admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. Like I just woke up from a very long dream where I was pretending to be a different person. Emma nodded thoughtfully. That's interesting. Tell me about that person you were pretending to be. Her question surprised me with its directness. Emma had always been perceptive, but her insight into my emotional state felt particularly sharp this morning. I wondered what I had said during my incoherent arrival, what revelations I had made while still in shock. The perfect Manhattan wife, I said slowly, testing the words. The woman who hosted dinner parties where every detail was flawless, who never challenged her husband's decisions, who gradually made herself smaller and smaller until she fit perfectly into the space he'd designated for her. And is that who you wanted to be? The question hung in the air between us, more loaded than it appeared. Because the truth was, I had wanted to be that person, at least initially. After years of independence and career focus, the idea of partnership, of being part of something larger than myself, had felt like evolution rather than diminishment. I thought I did, I replied. Marcus was so confident, so successful. Being with him felt like joining an exclusive club I'd never had access to before. The social events, the networking dinners, the charitable boards. It was seductive. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being Sarah Richardson, who happened to be married to a successful attorney, and became Mrs. Marcus Richardson, whose primary identity was reflected glory. Emma sipped her coffee, considering my words. When do you think that shift happened? I tried to pinpoint the moment when my own ambitions had become secondary, when my art therapy practice had transformed from a career to a hobby to an occasional volunteer activity. It hadn't been a single decision, but a series of small accommodations that accumulated over time. Probably around year 3 of our marriage, I said. Marcus made partner that year, and suddenly our social obligations tripled. He needed a wife who could entertain clients, who could represent the firm appropriately at events. My therapy practice seemed insignificant compared to his career trajectory. Did he ask you to give it up? He didn't have to. He made it clear that my professional obligations were obstacles to his success. Missed dinner parties because I had evening sessions with clients. Declining weekend trips because I had workshops to attend. He never said I couldn't work, but he created conditions where working became increasingly difficult. Emma's expression darkened. That's manipulation, Sarah. Subtle, but deliberate. I resented her characterization initially, the implication that I had been a victim rather than a willing participant in my marriage's evolution. But as I reflected on the pattern she'd identified, I began to see the systematic nature of changes I'd attributed to natural compromise. The thing is, I continued, I convinced myself I was choosing partnership over independence, that putting his career first was a mature decision that would benefit us both in the long run. And did it benefit you? The question forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. What had I gained from my decade of accommodation? Financial security, certainly. Social status within a particular Manhattan circle. The reflected prestige of being married to a successful attorney. But what had I lost in the process? I stopped writing, I said suddenly, the realization hitting me with unexpected force. I used to keep journals, write poetry sometimes. I had a blog about art therapy techniques that other practitioners actually read and commented on. When did I stop writing? Emma pulled out her phone and began scrolling. Actually, I looked up your old blog yesterday after you called. The last post was from 4 years ago. It was about helping children express trauma through creative expression. The comments were incredible, people talking about how your techniques had transformed their practice. 4 years. I tried to remember what had been happening in my marriage 4 years ago. What had finally caused me to abandon the last vestige of my professional identity. Marcus had been working on a series of high-profile cases, his name appearing regularly in legal journals and business publications. I had been proud of his success, had told anyone who would listen about his accomplishments. When had I stopped talking about my own? My phone buzzed against the nightstand, breaking into my reverie. Emma and I both looked at it, the device suddenly seeming to pulse with malevolent energy. 37 missed calls, I said, checking the screen. 24 voicemails, 62 text messages. All from Marcus? I scrolled through the notifications. Marcus. Victoria. Numbers I don't recognize. Some from friends in New York, probably people who were at the restaurant last night or heard about it secondhand. Emma leaned forward. What do you want to do about it? The question implied choice, agency, the radical idea that I could decide how to respond rather than simply reacting to Marcus's agenda. For 10 years, my communication patterns had been largely responsive. Marcus would initiate conversations about our plans, our social calendar, our major decisions, and I would adapt accordingly. I want to know what they're saying, I admitted, but I also don't want to be pulled back into Marcus's narrative about what happened. What if we listen to them together? I could help you process whatever manipulation tactics he's using. The idea of having support while confronting Marcus's version of events felt revolutionary. Throughout our marriage, I had handled his anger, his disappointment, his complex emotional states alone. The idea of having a witness, an advocate, someone who might help me maintain perspective, seemed almost too good to be true. We started with the text messages, which ranged from confused to angry to pleading. The early ones, sent immediately after I left the restaurant, were damage control. Sarah, please come back so we can discuss this properly. Making a scene helped no one. You're overreacting. Let's handle this like adults. As the evening progressed, his tone shifted to frustration. Your behavior tonight was unacceptable. I'm trying to be honest with you, and you're acting like a child. Victoria is mortified by your public display. This isn't how mature people handle difficult situations. By the early morning hours, desperation crept in. Where are you? I'm concerned about your safety. Please call me. We need to discuss practical arrangements. Sarah, I know you're hurt, but disappearing isn't solving anything. Emma read over my shoulder, her expression growing increasingly disgusted. Notice how every message centers on his needs, his feelings, his version of appropriate behavior? Not once does he acknowledge that his actions might have been hurtful or inappropriate. She was right. Even in his most conciliatory messages, Marcus positioned himself as the reasonable party, dealing with my emotional overreaction. My public confrontation was unacceptable and childish, while his decision to bring his mistress to our anniversary dinner was merely honest and mature. Let's try the voicemails, I said, steeling myself for whatever escalation they might contain. The first few followed the same pattern as his texts. Marcus's familiar attorney voice explaining my unreasonable behavior and demanding I contact him immediately to, quote, resolve this situation professionally. But as we progressed through his increasingly frantic messages, cracks appeared in his composed facade. Sarah, this is ridiculous. You've embarrassed both of us, and frankly, you've embarrassed yourself. Victoria is a respected professional in this city, and your behavior last night was completely inappropriate. I don't know what kind of reaction you were hoping for, but all you've accomplished is making yourself look unstable. Emma paused the playback. He's gaslighting you. Making you question your own perceptions by insisting that your reaction was the problem, not his behavior. The term felt accurate but also overwhelming. I had heard about gaslighting in my art therapy training, had helped clients recognize the pattern in their own relationships, but I had never applied the concept to my marriage. The systematic undermining of my perceptions, the redefinition of my reactions as inappropriate or excessive, the constant repositioning of Marcus as the rational party dealing with my emotional instability. Keep playing, I said quietly. The later messages revealed increasing desperation as Marcus realized I wasn't simply hiding at home. waiting for him to determine the terms of our reconciliation. Sarah, I've called all of your friends, and no one knows where you are. This is becoming genuinely concerning. Whatever you think about the situation with Victoria, disappearing isn't going to solve anything. We have practical matters to discuss, financial arrangements to make. You can't just vanish because you're upset. I've contacted your credit cards to make sure you're safe. I see you flew to Portland. I assume you're with Emma. That's fine, take some time to process this, but we need to talk soon. There are documents you need to sign, arrangements that can't wait indefinitely. The casual mention of monitoring my financial activity sent a chill through me. Marcus had access to all our accounts, could track my movements through credit card transactions and flight records. The privacy I thought I had gained by leaving New York was largely illusory. Emma noticed my expression. He tracked your credit cards? Joint accounts, I explained. Everything is connected to his primary financial management system. I couldn't make a purchase without it showing up in his monitoring apps. Sarah, that's financial surveillance. That's not normal in a healthy relationship. I tried to remember when Marcus had insisted on consolidating all our financial accounts, when he had convinced me that his superior understanding of investments and tax strategies made it logical for him to handle all our money management. It had seemed practical at the time, efficient. I earned significantly less than he did, and his attention to financial details had always exceeded mine. But now I realized that financial control was another form of constraint, another way Marcus had gradually limited my independence without my conscious recognition. The voicemails continued, revealing increasing frustration with my refusal to engage on his terms. This silence is childish, Sarah. I'm trying to handle a difficult situation with dignity, and you're punishing me for being honest about my feelings. Yes, I developed feelings for Victoria, but I could have simply continued the affair indefinitely. I chose to be truthful with you because I respect you enough to be direct. The least you could do is extend the same courtesy. Emma stopped the playback again. He's reframing his betrayal as a favor to you. As if bringing his mistress to your anniversary dinner was an act of respect rather than calculated cruelty. The pattern was becoming clear. Every message positioned Marcus as the victim of my unreasonable response. Every communication reframed his behavior as appropriate, while characterizing mine as problematic. Even his affair was presented as evidence of his integrity, his honesty, his commitment to treating me with respect. There are more, I said, noting the remaining voicemail notifications. The final messages, left in the early morning hours, revealed a different side of Marcus entirely. Fine, Sarah. If you want to play games, we'll play games. But you should know that your behavior last night has consequences. People talk in this city, and your public meltdown is already becoming the subject of conversation. I've spent years building a reputation, and I'm not going to let your emotional instability damage that. Get yourself together and call me, or I'll be forced to take steps to protect both of our interests. The threat was vague but unmistakable. Marcus was positioning my response to his betrayal as potential damage to his professional reputation, implying that he might take action to control the narrative if I didn't cooperate with his version of events. Emma and I sat in silence after the final message ended, processing the evolution of his communication from manipulation to intimidation. He's scared, Emma observed finally. All of that bluster is because he's losing control of the situation, and he doesn't know how to handle it. Her analysis felt accurate. Throughout our marriage, Marcus had maintained control through careful management of information and circumstances. He determined when we socialized and with whom, how we spent money, where we traveled, even what we discussed and how. My public confrontation had shattered that control, had forced him into reactive mode rather than his preferred strategic position. The question is, Emma continued, what do you want to do now? You can't hide in Portland forever, and you're going to have to deal with the practical aspects of your marriage ending eventually. The practical aspects. Divorce proceedings, asset division, the Manhattan penthouse that I had thought of as home but which was legally Marcus's property, purchased before our marriage and never transferred to joint ownership. The realization that I might be facing not just emotional devastation but financial vulnerability added another layer of anxiety to my already overwhelming situation. I don't know, I admitted. I haven't thought beyond getting away from that restaurant, from that moment. That's okay, but maybe it's time to start thinking ahead. What do you want your life to look like after Marcus? The question forced me to confront how thoroughly I had defined myself in relation to my marriage. What did I want, independent of Marcus's needs and expectations? What kind of life would I build if I were starting fresh at 38? I want to write again, I said, surprising myself with the immediacy of the response. I want to finish my certification in trauma-focused art therapy. I want to work with clients again, not just volunteer at fundraising events. What else? I want friends who know me as Sarah, not as Marcus's wife. I want to travel places because I'm interested in them, not because they advance someone else's career. I want to live somewhere that feels like home, not like a showroom. Emma smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since arriving. Those sound like good goals, achievable goals. But first I have to survive a divorce from someone who clearly intends to make the process as difficult as possible. That's where planning becomes important. Marcus is going to try to maintain control. Through the legal proceedings, through financial pressure, through social manipulation. You need to be prepared for that. The idea of strategic thinking about my divorce felt simultaneously empowering and exhausting. For so long, I had allowed Marcus to handle complex planning while I focused on immediate concerns. The prospect of outsmarting him at his own game seemed daunting. I don't even have my own attorney, I realized. Marcus knows every divorce lawyer in Manhattan. He'll know their strategies, their weaknesses. So don't use a Manhattan attorney. Find someone he doesn't know. Someone who specializes in cases involving financial manipulation and control. Emma's suggestion revealed another assumption I had been making unconsciously. That my divorce would necessarily be handled within Marcus's professional network, according to his preferences and timeline. But there was no reason I couldn't choose my own representation, set my own terms for the proceedings. I need to go back to New York eventually, I said. I have things in that apartment, documents I'll need. But not yet. First, let's get you properly prepared. Let's find you an attorney who specializes in cases like yours. Let's figure out what assets you're entitled to, what evidence you'll need to document the financial surveillance and emotional manipulation. Emma's use of clinical terms to describe my marriage felt jarring but also clarifying. Financial surveillance, emotional manipulation, systematic isolation. These weren't just unfortunate dynamics that had developed naturally, they were patterns of behavior with names. Behaviors that attorneys and therapists recognized as problematic. My phone buzzed with another call, Marcus's name appearing on the screen. This time, instead of the panic and dread I had felt earlier, I experienced something different. Curiosity about what new manipulation tactic he might employ, what threats or promises he might offer to regain control of our interaction. Answer it, Emma suggested. But put it on speaker. Let's hear what he has to say when he thinks you're alone and vulnerable. I accepted the call, Marcus's familiar voice filling Emma's guest bedroom with its practiced authority. Sarah, thank God, I've been worried sick about you. Are you all right? The concern in his voice sounded genuine, but I had learned enough in the past 24 hours to recognize performance when I heard it. I'm fine, Marcus. Where are you? I know you flew to Portland, but Emma's not answering her phone either. This disappearing act isn't like you. The casual admission that he had been monitoring my travel, combined with his attempts to contact Emma, revealed the extent of his surveillance efforts. Nothing about his behavior suggested respect for my privacy or autonomy. I'm safe. That's all you need to know. A pause, during which I could practically hear Marcus recalibrating his approach. Sarah, I understand that you're hurt and angry. I handled the situation poorly last night, and I take full responsibility for that. But we're both adults, and we need to discuss this rationally. The apology was carefully worded, acknowledging poor handling rather than poor behavior, accepting responsibility for tactics rather than choices. Which part did you handle poorly, Marcus? Conducting an 18-month affair, or bringing your mistress to our anniversary dinner to inform me you were leaving? Both, he said quickly. You're absolutely right to be angry about both. I should have told you about Victoria months ago. And I definitely should have found a more private way to discuss our future plans. Our future plans. Even in his apology, Marcus positioned his affair and departure as joint decisions rather than unilateral betrayals. What do you want, Marcus? I want us to handle this divorce with dignity and mutual respect. We both have reputations to protect, careers that could be damaged by a protracted, public dispute. I've spoken with Patricia Morrison at Klein Morrison & Associates. She's agreed to represent both of us in an uncontested proceeding. The suggestion that we share legal representation for our divorce revealed the extent of Marcus's continued desire for control. An attorney representing both parties would necessarily prioritize expediting the proceedings over protecting either party's individual interests. That seems like a conflict of interest, I said carefully. Only if we can't agree on terms. Patricia assures me that most couples in our situation can reach amicable arrangements without adversarial representation. It's faster, cheaper, and much less public than traditional divorce proceedings. Emma was shaking her head vigorously, writing notes on a pad beside her. Red flag. He wants to control your legal representation. I'll need to think about it, I said. Marcus's voice sharpened slightly. What's to think about? The longer we drag this out, the more complicated and expensive it becomes. I'm trying to make this as painless as possible for both of us. Painless for both of us? Or painless for you? Sarah, don't be difficult. I know you're upset, but making this harder than it needs to be doesn't benefit anyone. The familiar phrase, don't be difficult, hit me like a physical blow. How many times had Marcus used those exact words to dismiss my concerns, to reframe my legitimate questions as unreasonable demands? I have to go, I said abruptly. Wait, Sarah, we need to discuss practical matters. The apartment, the joint accounts, your personal belongings. I can't leave everything in limbo indefinitely while you process your emotions. His dismissal of my emotional response as something to be processed quickly so we could return to practical matters revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of what he had done. This wasn't a minor disagreement that required brief processing time. This was the destruction of our entire shared life. The revelation that my marriage had been built on lies and manipulation. I'll contact you when I'm ready to discuss practical matters. When will that be? I'm trying to be patient, but I have commitments, responsibilities that can't wait indefinitely. Then don't wait, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Make whatever arrangements you need to make, Marcus. I'll make mine. I ended the call before he could respond, my heart pounding with the adrenaline of direct confrontation. Emma applauded slowly, her expression proud and somewhat surprised. That was perfect. You didn't get drawn into his manipulation, you didn't accept his framing of the situation, and you maintained your autonomy. It felt terrifying, I admitted. Of course it did. You've been trained for 10 years to accommodate his needs and accept his version of reality. Standing up to that conditioning takes courage. The afternoon passed in research and planning. Emma helped me locate attorneys in Portland who specialized in divorce cases involving financial control and emotional abuse. We gathered documentation of our joint accounts, credit card statements, and property records. We created a timeline of Marcus's systematic isolation tactics, his gradual assumption of control over our finances, social life, and major decisions. By evening, I had appointments scheduled with 2 different attorneys for the following week, had opened my own bank account at a credit union Marcus had no connection to, and had begun the process of establishing an independent financial identity. More importantly, I had begun to see my marriage not as a failed partnership but as a decade-long manipulation that I had finally escaped. The woman who had walked out of Le Bernardin wasn't the same person who had entered that restaurant, and she was definitely not the same woman who had been gradually diminished over 10 years of systematic control. As Emma's family gathered for dinner, I watched their easy interactions with new appreciation. David asked Emma about her photography projects with genuine interest. The teenagers shared details about their school days without fear of judgment or criticism. Disagreements were discussed openly without anyone being labeled difficult or unreasonable. This, I realized, was what healthy family dynamics looked like. This was the kind of relationship I wanted to build in whatever life came next. That night, as I prepared for bed in Emma's guest room, I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone I hadn't encountered in years. Not Mrs. Marcus Richardson, the perfect Manhattan wife. Not even Sarah Richardson, the woman who had defined herself in relation to her husband's success. Just Sarah, 38 years old, with a master's degree in art therapy, 10 years of marriage ending, and an entire future to determine for herself. For the first time in longer than I could remember, that prospect felt more exciting than terrifying. 3 weeks into my stay in Portland, I sat across from Catherine Walsh in her downtown law office, a space that felt more like a therapist's sanctuary than a traditional legal environment. Soft lighting, comfortable seating, and walls lined with books about trauma recovery and women's rights created an atmosphere of safety I hadn't expected to find in an attorney's office. Catherine herself, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and penetrating green eyes, had come highly recommended by a domestic violence shelter Emma volunteered with. "Before we discuss legal strategy," Catherine said, pouring tea from a ceramic pot decorated with hand-painted flowers, "I want you to understand something important. What you've described isn't just infidelity or a marriage that grew apart. The pattern of behavior you've outlined meets the clinical definition of coercive control." The term was new to me, though Emma had mentioned it during our late-night conversations about my marriage. Catherine opened a thick folder and withdrew several documents, spreading them across the coffee table between us. Coercive control is a pattern of behavior designed to limit someone's freedom and autonomy through systematic intimidation, isolation, and manipulation. It's often invisible to the victim because it develops gradually and is disguised as care, protection, or practical assistance. She handed me a checklist of behaviors, each item accompanied by examples and explanations. As I read through the list, my stomach tightened with recognition. Financial control, monitoring of daily activities, isolation from family and friends, undermining of self-confidence and decision-making abilities, control over social interactions and professional opportunities. "How many of these behaviors do you recognize from your marriage?" Catherine asked gently. I counted silently, my pen marking items with growing alarm. 23 out of 30 behaviors were familiar, some so ingrained in my marriage dynamic that I had never questioned their normalcy. "Most of them," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's what I expected." Marcus's behavior follows a textbook pattern. The gradual assumption of financial control, the systematic isolation from your support network, the professional sabotage disguised as practical concerns about your career interfering with his success. Even bringing Victoria to your anniversary dinner fits the pattern. How does that fit? Catherine leaned back in her chair, her expression serious. Public humiliation is a common tactic when other forms of control begin to fail. By forcing you to discover his affair in the most degrading way possible, he was attempting to break down your remaining self-esteem and make you grateful for whatever scraps of relationship he was willing to offer. The explanation hit me with devastating clarity. Marcus hadn't brought Victoria to dinner because he respected me enough to be honest. He had orchestrated that confrontation as a power play, designed to leave me so emotionally destroyed that I would accept any terms he offered, rather than face further humiliation. What he didn't anticipate, Catherine continued with a slight smile, was that you would refuse to play the victim. Your public confrontation disrupted his script completely. I thought about Marcus's increasingly frantic voicemails, his demands that I contact him immediately to discuss practical arrangements. His frustration hadn't been concern for my well-being, but panic at losing control of the narrative he had so carefully constructed. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now we build a case that protects your interests and holds him accountable for his behavior. But I need to warn you, Sarah. Marcus is going to escalate his control attempts as the divorce proceedings begin. Men like him don't surrender power easily." Catherine's prediction proved accurate within hours of my leaving her office. I returned to Emma's house to find her pacing the kitchen, her phone clutched in her hand and her expression furious. "He called my workplace," she said without preamble. "Marcus contacted the gallery and told them I was harboring his mentally unstable wife, that I was enabling your self-destructive behavior by refusing to encourage you to seek help." The audacity of Marcus's manipulation took my breath away. He had targeted Emma professionally, attempting to pressure her employer to intervene in our family situation. What did your boss say? Fortunately, Janet has known me for 8 years and immediately recognized the call as manipulation. But Marcus was persuasive, Sarah. He painted a picture of you having a complete mental breakdown, claimed you were refusing medication and therapy, said he was concerned for your safety. I sank into a kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the systematic nature of his attack. Marcus wasn't just trying to control me directly anymore. He was attempting to turn my support system against me by positioning himself as the concerned husband dealing with an unstable wife. Did he contact anyone else? Emma nodded grimly. David's architectural firm received a similar call. He told them he was worried about your influence on me, that you were filling my head with paranoid delusions about your marriage. The pattern was becoming clear. Marcus was methodically targeting everyone who might support me, using his considerable charm and legal expertise to plant seeds of doubt about my mental state. If he could convince people I was unstable, my version of events would be dismissed as the ravings of a woman having a breakdown. He's trying to isolate you again, Emma observed. But this time he's doing it from 3,000 miles away. Her analysis was correct, but recognizing the tactic didn't make it less effective. I felt a familiar sense of being cornered, of having my reality questioned by someone with more social power and credibility than I possessed. My phone rang, and I recognized the number of my former art therapy supervisor, Dr. Jennifer Martinez. I had worked under her guidance during my master's program and maintained contact even after Marcus convinced me to reduce my clinical practice. Sarah. Jennifer's voice carried concern and confusion. I received the strangest call today. A man claiming to be your husband said you were having a psychological crisis and asked if I had observed any signs of mental instability during our professional relationship. I closed my eyes, feeling the web of Marcus's manipulations spreading to encompass every corner of my life. What did you tell him? I told him that I couldn't discuss your mental health with anyone without your written consent, and that his approach was highly inappropriate. But Sarah, what's going on? The questions he was asking, the way he was framing your behavior, it sounded like he was building a case for involuntary commitment. The possibility that Marcus might try to have me declared mentally incompetent had never occurred to me. But Jennifer's professional assessment sent ice through my veins. If Marcus could convince a court that I was mentally unstable, he could potentially gain control over not just our divorce proceedings but my personal autonomy. I left him 3 weeks ago after discovering he'd been having an affair for 18 months. He brought his mistress to our anniversary dinner to tell me they were moving to Los Angeles together. Jesus, Sarah. And he's claiming you're the one with mental health issues? Apparently. He's systematically contacting people in my life to suggest that I'm having a breakdown, that my reaction to his betrayal is evidence of psychological instability. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, processing the information. This is a classic deflection tactic used by abusive partners. When their control is threatened, they often try to pathologize their victims' normal responses to abnormal treatment. Another professional using clinical language to describe my marriage. The accumulation of expert opinions was both validating and overwhelming. I had spent 10 years believing my marriage was normal, if not ideal. Now I was learning that mental health professionals, domestic violence advocates, and experienced divorce attorneys all recognized clear patterns of abuse in Marcus's behavior. Jennifer, I need to ask you something. During the time we worked together, did you observe anything about my mental state that seemed concerning? Absolutely not. You are one of the most insightful and emotionally intelligent students I supervised. Your ability to maintain professional boundaries while showing genuine empathy with clients was exceptional. If anything, I always thought you were too hard on yourself, too willing to doubt your own perceptions. Her assessment provided some relief, but it also highlighted how much my self-confidence had eroded during my marriage. The woman Jennifer remembered, professionally competent and emotionally stable, felt like a stranger to me now. I'm keeping detailed records of all these contacts, I told her. My attorney says Marcus's behavior constitutes harassment. Good. And Sarah? If you need a professional reference for your mental health status, I'd be happy to provide one. What Marcus described to me bears no resemblance to the person I know you to be. After ending the call, I sat in Emma's kitchen, feeling simultaneously grateful for Jennifer's support and terrified by the scope of Marcus's campaign against me. He wasn't just fighting our divorce, he was attempting to destroy my credibility and reputation systematically. Emma returned from her afternoon gallery shift to find me researching involuntary commitment laws in New York State. Her expression darkened as I explained Marcus's latest tactics. He can't actually have you committed without significant evidence of danger to yourself or others, she said after reviewing the legal requirements I'd found online. But he can make the process miserable by forcing me to defend my sanity repeatedly. Every professional relationship I have, every friend who might support me, he's going to contact them with his version of events. Then we get ahead of the narrative. We contact people first, explain what's really happening before Marcus can plant his version in their minds. Emma's strategy made sense, but it required me to have difficult conversations with colleagues and friends I hadn't spoken to in years. Marcus's systematic isolation had been so effective that my professional network was largely dormant, my personal relationships reduced to superficial social interactions. I don't even know who to call, I admitted. He's been so successful at limiting my connections that I'm not sure I have anyone left who would believe my version over his. Emma pulled out her laptop and opened a social media site. Let's start with your old blog followers. You had hundreds of people who respected your professional expertise. Surely some of them would remember you as competent and stable. The idea of reaching out to former colleagues and clients felt overwhelming, but Emma was right. Marcus's campaign of character assassination would be most effective if I remained isolated and defensive. By proactively sharing my story, I could potentially neutralize some of his manipulation tactics. We spent the evening crafting a careful message explaining my situation without revealing private details about my marriage. I focused on Marcus's professional harassment of people in my network, his attempts to portray my normal response to betrayal as mental instability, and his systematic effort to control the narrative of our divorce. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Former colleagues expressed outrage at Marcus's unprofessional behavior. Art therapy practitioners who had followed my blog shared their own experiences with manipulative partners who used similar tactics. Several people offered professional references, housing if I needed it, and emotional support. Most significantly, 3 women reached out to share their own experiences with Marcus. 2 had worked with him professionally and described behavior that made them uncomfortable, boundary violations disguised as professional charm. The third was a client's ex-wife who had divorced a partner from Marcus's law firm and recognized the tactics he was employing. This is bigger than just your marriage, Emma observed as we read through the responses. Marcus has a pattern of manipulative behavior that extends beyond romantic relationships. The messages provided validation but also revealed the scope of what I was facing. Marcus wasn't just an unfaithful husband trying to control a difficult divorce. He was someone who used manipulation and intimidation as standard operating procedures in both personal and professional contexts. Catherine called the next morning after receiving documentation of Marcus's harassment campaign. This changes everything, she said, her voice energized. Marcus has given us evidence of continued coercive behavior after separation. Courts take post-separation abuse very seriously, especially when it includes harassment of third parties. What does that mean for our case? It means we can request emergency protective orders that will prevent him from contacting you directly or indirectly. It also strengthens our argument for a larger settlement, since his behavior demonstrates the lengths he'll go to maintain control. The legal implications were encouraging, but I was more interested in the immediate relief from Marcus's campaign of intimidation. How quickly can we get protective orders in place? I can file tomorrow morning. But Sarah, you need to be prepared for Marcus to escalate further when he realizes his harassment tactics have backfired. Catherine's warning proved prescient within 24 hours. I woke to find Emma's husband David in the kitchen, his jaw tight with anger as he scrolled through his phone. Marcus has created a website, he said without preamble. What kind of website? David turned his phone toward me, revealing a professional-looking page titled, Concerned Family and Friends of Sarah Richardson. The site featured my wedding photo alongside text expressing worry about my mental health status, claims that I was refusing treatment for psychological issues, and requests for anyone with information about my whereabouts to contact Marcus immediately. The sophisticated design and convincing tone made the site appear legitimate, like a genuine effort by loved ones to locate a missing person in crisis. Only someone familiar with the actual circumstances would recognize it as an elaborate manipulation tactic. "He's weaponizing the internet," Emma said, reading over David's shoulder. "Making it look like you're a mentally ill woman whose family is desperately trying to help her." I stared at the website, feeling physically sick. Marcus had used our wedding photos, images of the happiest day of our relationship, to support his narrative of my mental instability. The violation felt profound and deeply personal. "Can we get this taken down?" David shook his head. "It's hosted on a platform that requires court orders to remove content. The process could take weeks or months." The website represented a new level of public humiliation, potentially visible to anyone who searched my name online. Future employers, landlords, potential romantic partners would find this professionally designed site suggesting I was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. I called Catherine immediately, my voice shaking as I described Marcus's latest escalation. "This definitely qualifies as cyberstalking," she said grimly. "We'll include it in our emergency petition. But Sarah, I need you to understand something. This level of retaliation suggests Marcus is feeling genuinely threatened by your independence. People don't create elaborate harassment campaigns unless they're desperately trying to regain control. So this is actually a good sign? In a twisted way, yes. Marcus is revealing the extent of his manipulative capabilities, because subtler methods have failed. He's essentially providing evidence for our case against him." Catherine's legal perspective was reassuring, but the emotional impact of seeing my life and marriage reframed as evidence of my mental illness left me feeling raw and vulnerable. Marcus had turned our most intimate moments into weapons against me, using his considerable resources and professional skills to destroy my reputation and credibility. That afternoon, I received a call from my former neighbor in Manhattan, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had lived in our building for 30 years and had always been kind to me. "Sarah, dear, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from your sister's website." "My sister's website?" "The one asking for help finding you. I've been so worried since reading about your situation. Are you getting the help you need?" The realization that Marcus's manipulation site was already reaching people in my New York life filled me with despair. Mrs. Chen, who had known me for years as a stable, responsible neighbor, was now questioning my mental state based on Marcus's online campaign. "Mrs. Chen, I need to tell you what's really happening. I discovered that my husband was having an affair, and when I left him, he began spreading false information about my mental health to control the divorce proceedings." A long silence followed my explanation. When Mrs. Chen spoke again, her voice carried new understanding. "Oh, my dear, I knew something wasn't right about that website. It seemed so unlike you, and frankly unlike what a loving husband would do if he were genuinely concerned." Her words brought tears to my eyes. Even manipulated by Marcus's sophisticated deception, Mrs. Chen's genuine knowledge of my character had created doubt about his narrative. "Has he contacted anyone else in the building?" "Several people, actually. He spoke with the doorman, the building manager, even some of the other residents. He seemed to be gathering information about your daily routines, your visitors, your general behavior over the past few years." The extent of Marcus's investigation into my personal life was staggering. He was treating our divorce like a legal case, gathering evidence and witness statements to support his version of events. The man I had lived with for 10 years was now conducting surveillance on my past behavior, looking for anything he could use to support his claims about my mental instability. "Mrs. Chen, if anyone else asks you about me, would you tell them what you just told me, that you've known me for years as a stable, responsible person?" "Of course, dear." "And Sarah? Whatever you're going through, you don't deserve to have your character attacked like this. What he's doing isn't the behavior of a loving husband concerned about his wife's well-being." Her validation meant more than she could know. After weeks of having my perceptions and reactions questioned, hearing someone who knew both Marcus and me recognize the manipulation was profoundly healing. Emma found me crying in the guest bedroom after ending the call with Mrs. Chen. He's trying to rewrite our entire history, I told her through tears. Not just the marriage, but my whole personality, my character, everything I've ever been to anyone. Emma sat beside me on the bed, her expression fierce with protective anger. He can try, but he can't change the truth. People who actually know you, who've worked with you and lived near you and been helped by you, they see through his manipulation. But what about people who don't know me? Future employers? Potential friends? Anyone who searches my name online? We'll figure out how to counteract his campaign. Catherine is working on legal remedies, and we can create our own online presence that tells the real story. Emma's determination to fight Marcus's manipulation gave me strength, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped in a battle I never wanted to fight. All I had done was discover my husband's affair and refuse to accept his version of appropriate behavior. In response, he had launched a comprehensive campaign to destroy my reputation and credibility. That evening, as I prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman reflected there looked tired and somewhat fragile, but she also looked determined. The frightened victim who had fled from Le Bernardin 3 weeks earlier was transforming into someone capable of strategic thinking and direct action. Marcus had made a crucial error in his campaign against me. By targeting so many people so aggressively, he had revealed the systematic nature of his manipulation. People who might have believed his claims about my mental instability were instead recognizing his behavior as the real problem. As I settled into bed, my phone buzzed with another message from someone who had seen Marcus's website and wanted to offer support. This time it was Dr. Rodriguez, a colleague from my graduate program, who had followed my blog for years. Sarah, I don't know what's happening in your personal life, but the woman I knew in school and followed online was one of the most professionally competent and emotionally intelligent people I've encountered. If you need references or support, please don't hesitate to ask. I smiled as I typed my response, feeling something I hadn't experienced since that night at Le Bernardin. Not just relief or gratitude, but genuine hope. Marcus's manipulation was backfiring, revealing his true character to everyone who witnessed it. Tomorrow I would meet with Catherine to file the emergency protective orders. We would begin the legal process of holding Marcus accountable for his harassment and abuse. More importantly, we would start building the case for a divorce settlement that recognized the true nature of our marriage and the systematic control he had maintained for 10 years. For the first time since my marriage had imploded, I felt like I was fighting back rather than simply surviving. Marcus had underestimated the woman he had tried so hard to diminish, and that miscalculation was about to become very expensive for him. The emergency hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in downtown Portland, and I stood outside the courthouse at 8 in the morning, my hands steady as I clutched the folder containing evidence of Marcus's harassment campaign. Catherine stood beside me, her expression confident and focused, reviewing her notes one final time before we faced whatever legal team Marcus had assembled. He flew in yesterday, Catherine informed me, scanning the courthouse steps. My colleague spotted him at the hotel with 2 attorneys from his New York firm. He's taking this more seriously than I expected. The fact that Marcus had brought backup counsel to fight a protective order request revealed how threatened he felt by my newfound legal advocacy. For weeks, he had operated under the assumption that I would eventually capitulate to his demands and accept whatever settlement terms he deemed appropriate. My systematic documentation of his harassment had apparently convinced him that I was no longer the compliant wife he had married. "Are you ready for this?" Catherine asked, noting my focused expression. I considered her question honestly. Was I ready to face Marcus in a legal setting, to present evidence of his manipulation and abuse to a judge who would determine whether his behavior warranted court intervention? 6 months ago, the prospect would have terrified me. Today, it felt like an opportunity to reclaim my voice and hold him accountable for his actions. Yes, I said simply. I'm ready. We entered the courthouse and proceeded to the family law division, where I caught my first glimpse of Marcus in over a month. He sat at the respondent's table flanked by 2 impeccably dressed attorneys, his own appearance polished and confident. He looked every inch the successful Manhattan lawyer, calm and slightly bemused by what his expression suggested were frivolous proceedings initiated by an emotionally unstable ex-wife. When his eyes met mine across the courtroom, I saw a flicker of surprise. The woman he was looking at wasn't the shattered victim who had fled from Le Bernardin. I had dressed carefully for the hearing in a navy suit that projected competence and stability, and I held myself with a confidence that had been growing stronger each day since my arrival in Portland. Marcus leaned over to whisper something to his lead attorney, a silver-haired woman whose expensive clothing and imperious demeanor suggested she was accustomed to intimidating opposing parties into submission. I watched their conference with detached interest, recognizing the strategic calculations they were undoubtedly making about how to portray me to the judge. Judge Harrison, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, called the hearing to order and reviewed the emergency petition Catherine had filed. This is a request for protective orders, preventing the respondent from contacting the petitioner directly or through third parties, and restraining him from further harassment of her professional and personal contacts, Judge Harrison announced. Counselor Walsh, please present your evidence. Catherine stood and approached the bench with the comprehensive documentation we had assembled. Marcus's voicemails and text messages, screenshots of his harassment website, testimonial statements from the colleagues and neighbors he had contacted, records of his attempts to interfere with Emma's employment, and my professional reputation. Your Honor, the evidence demonstrates a clear pattern of post-separation abuse designed to isolate the petitioner and undermine her credibility. Mr. Richardson has systematically contacted her professional contacts, family members, and former neighbors in an effort to portray her normal response to marital betrayal as evidence of mental instability. As Catherine methodically presented each piece of evidence, I watched Marcus's confident expression gradually shift to one of concern. His attorneys passed notes frantically, clearly unprepared for the scope and detail of our documentation. The respondent has created a sophisticated website using the petitioner's personal photographs and private information to suggest she is mentally ill and potentially dangerous. Catherine continued, displaying printouts of Marcus's manipulation site. This represents cyberstalking and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Judge Harrison examined the website materials with evident disapproval, her expression darkening as she read through Marcus's carefully crafted narrative of my supposed mental health crisis. Mr. Richardson, she said, looking directly at Marcus, did you create this website? Marcus rose, his composure intact despite the damaging evidence Catherine had presented. Your Honor, I was genuinely concerned about my wife's mental state following her public breakdown at a restaurant. She disappeared without explanation, refused to respond to reasonable attempts at communication, and demonstrated behavior that suggested she might be experiencing a psychological crisis. His response was perfectly crafted, positioning his harassment as legitimate concern, while portraying my escape to Portland as evidence of instability. This was Marcus at his most dangerous, using his legal training and natural charisma to reframe his abusive behavior as appropriate response to my alleged problems. The website was created as a resource for family and friends who were also concerned about Sarah's well-being. I had no intention of causing her distress, only of ensuring she received appropriate help if she was indeed experiencing a mental health emergency. Judge Harrison was not impressed by his explanation. Mr. Richardson, did you obtain your wife's consent before using her personal photographs and private information on this website? Given her unresponsive state and apparent psychological distress, consent was not possible to obtain. Did you consult with any mental health professionals before concluding that your wife was experiencing a psychological crisis? Marcus hesitated slightly, recognizing the trap in the judge's question. I relied on my observations of her behavior and the concerns expressed by other people who witnessed her public breakdown. Public breakdown, Judge Harrison repeated, consulting Catherine's documentation. You mean her response to discovering that you had brought your mistress to your anniversary dinner to inform her that you were ending your marriage? The courtroom fell silent. Marcus's lead attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm, clearly concerned about the direction of his testimony, but Marcus pressed forward with his characterization of events. Your Honor, my wife's reaction was disproportionate to the situation. While I acknowledge that my handling of our marital difficulties was imperfect, her behavior that evening suggested deeper psychological issues that required professional intervention. Judge Harrison set down the documents and fixed Marcus with a stare that could have frozen water. Mr. Richardson, Let me understand your position. You conducted an 18-month extramarital affair, brought your paramour to your anniversary dinner to inform your wife that you were leaving her, and then when she responded with anger and left the restaurant, you concluded that she was mentally ill? The judge's summary of events revealed the absurdity of Marcus's narrative more effectively than any argument Catherine could have made. In the stark language of legal proceedings, his behavior appeared exactly as manipulative and cruel as it had been. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, when your wife exercised her right to leave you and seek support from her family, you created a harassment campaign designed to undermine her reputation and credibility with her professional contacts. Marcus's lead attorney finally intervened, standing to address the court. Your Honor, my client's concerns about his wife's mental state were genuine, if perhaps misguided in their expression. Mr. Richardson is a respected attorney with no history of domestic violence or harassment. His actions, while admittedly intrusive, were motivated by concern rather than malice. The attorney's argument was skillfully presented, acknowledging the problematic nature of Marcus's behavior while reframing it as misguided care rather than deliberate abuse. This was exactly the kind of legal maneuvering that had made Marcus successful in his career, the ability to present harmful actions as reasonable responses to difficult circumstances. Catherine rose to respond, her voice clear and confident. Your Honor, the respondent's claim of concern is contradicted by the systematic and sophisticated nature of his harassment campaign. This was not the impulsive action of a worried spouse, but a calculated effort to destroy the petitioner's reputation and force her into accepting his terms for their divorce. She approached the bench with additional documentation I had helped prepare. We have evidence that Mr. Richardson began his harassment campaign within hours of the petitioner's departure from New York. He immediately accessed her financial accounts to track her location, contacted her employer and family members with false claims about her mental state, and created a professional-grade website designed to appear as if concerned loved ones were seeking help for a mentally ill person. Catherine's presentation was devastating in its thoroughness. She had transformed Marcus's narrative of concerned husband into clear evidence of systematic abuse and manipulation. Moreover, Your Honor, we have testimony from multiple sources indicating that Mr. Richardson's manipulative behavior extends beyond his marriage. Former colleagues and professional contacts have described a pattern of boundary violations and intimidation tactics that suggest this is not an isolated incident, but part of a broader behavioral pattern. Judge Harrison reviewed the testimonial statements Catherine had gathered, her expression growing increasingly severe. Mr. Richardson, do you have an explanation for the testimony of Dr. Jennifer Martinez, who states that you contacted her seeking confidential information about your wife's mental health and made inappropriate inquiries about involuntary commitment procedures? Marcus's facade finally cracked, revealing the anger and frustration he had been suppressing throughout the hearing. Your Honor, I was genuinely concerned that Sarah might harm herself or others. Her behavior was completely unlike anything I had observed during our marriage. I was seeking professional guidance about how to help her. By attempting to have her committed involuntarily? By exploring all available options to ensure her safety and the safety of others. Judge Harrison's expression made clear what she thought of Marcus's explanation. She set aside the documents and addressed both legal teams directly. I've heard enough testimony to make my determination. The evidence presented demonstrates a clear pattern of harassment, intimidation, and attempted control that goes far beyond legitimate concern for a spouse's well-being. She turned her attention specifically to Marcus, her voice carrying the full authority of the court. Mr. Richardson, your behavior following your wife's departure constitutes stalking, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The fact that you are an attorney makes your conduct particularly egregious, as you should understand better than most people the legal and ethical boundaries you have violated. Marcus's confident demeanor finally collapsed entirely. For the first time since I had known him, he appeared genuinely surprised and off balance, clearly unprepared for a judge who saw through his manipulation tactics. I am granting the petitioner's request for protective orders in full, Judge Harrison announced. Mr. Richardson, you are hereby restrained from contacting the petitioner directly or indirectly, from attempting to communicate with her through third parties, and from posting any information about her on social media or other internet platforms. She paused to let the weight of her orders settle over the courtroom. Furthermore, you will immediately remove the website you created using her personal information and photographs. Failure to comply with this order within 48 hours will result in contempt of court charges and potential criminal prosecution for cyberstalking. The comprehensive nature of the protective orders exceeded even Catherine's expectations. Judge Harrison was not only preventing Marcus from contacting me, but actively requiring him to undo the damage his harassment campaign had already caused. Additionally, the judge continued, given the evidence of financial surveillance and control presented in this case, I am ordering that all joint accounts between the parties be frozen pending resolution of their divorce proceedings. Both parties will have equal access to marshal funds through court-supervised distribution only. This ruling hit Marcus like a physical blow. His entire strategy had been based on maintaining financial control over our divorce proceedings, using his superior resources and access to our joint assets to pressure me into accepting unfavorable terms. Judge Harrison had just eliminated that advantage completely. Marcus's lead attorney requested permission to address the court, clearly desperate to minimize the damage from the hearing. Your Honor, while we respect the court's decision, we request that Mr. Richardson be permitted to communicate with his wife through attorneys regarding the practical aspects of their divorce proceedings. Communication regarding divorce proceedings may occur solely through legal counsel, Judge Harrison agreed. However, any attempt to circumvent these protective orders through inappropriate use of legal communications will result in immediate sanctions. The hearing concluded with instructions for both parties to appear for a follow-up review in 30 days, giving the court time to ensure Marcus had complied with the protective orders and removed his harassment website. As we gathered our materials and prepared to leave the courtroom, I caught Marcus staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger or frustration, but something approaching genuine surprise. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, I had refused to be managed, controlled, or intimidated by his superior legal knowledge and social position. Catherine and I walked from the courthouse in triumphant silence, both understanding that we had achieved far more than we had hoped for. The protective orders were comprehensive and enforceable. Marcus's harassment website would be removed within days, and most importantly, the court had recognized the systematic nature of his abuse. How do you feel? Catherine asked as we reached her car. I considered her question carefully. How did I feel after watching the man who had controlled and manipulated me for 10 years be held accountable by a judge who saw through his carefully constructed facade? Free, I said finally. For the first time and longer than I can remember, I feel completely free. The drive back to Emma's house passed in comfortable silence, both of us processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Marcus's comprehensive defeat in court represented more than just legal victory. It was validation that my perceptions of his behavior had been accurate, that the systematic control and manipulation I had experienced were real and recognizable to objective observers. That evening, as I prepared dinner with Emma's family, my phone remained blissfully silent for the first time in weeks. The absence of Marcus's threatening calls, manipulative texts, and constant demands for communication felt like emerging from underwater after nearly drowning. So what happens now? Emma asked as we cleaned up after dinner. Now I get to discover who I am when I'm not defined in relation to Marcus, I replied, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Any ideas where you want to start? I thought about Catherine's question that morning about whether I was ready, about the confidence I had felt walking into that courtroom to face the man who had spent years undermining my self-trust and independence. I want to go back to New York, I said suddenly, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. Not to reconcile or negotiate with Marcus, but to reclaim the life I built there before I let him convince me it wasn't valuable enough to maintain. Emma nodded, understanding immediately what I meant. Your art therapy practice, your professional network, your apartment if you can get access to it, all of it. Marcus spent so much energy trying to convince everyone that I was mentally unstable and professionally incompetent. I want to show them who I really am when I'm not being systematically undermined by someone who claimed to love me. The prospect of returning to Manhattan, of facing the people Marcus had contacted with his false narrative should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like the natural next step in reclaiming the identity I had gradually surrendered during my marriage. When? Emma asked. Next week. Catherine says it will take several days for Marcus to comply with the court orders, and I want to be there when he's forced to remove that website and face the professional consequences of his behavior. Emma smiled, recognizing the strategic thinking that had emerged from my weeks of legal preparation. You know what I think? I think Marcus made a crucial error when he underestimated how strong you would become once you stopped trying to meet his expectations. Her observation felt accurate. Marcus had been so confident in his ability to control and manipulate me that he had revealed the full extent of his abusive tactics, providing exactly the evidence Catherine needed to secure comprehensive protective orders. As I settled into bed that night, I reflected on the day's events with something approaching gratitude. Not gratitude for the pain Marcus had caused, but appreciation for the clarity his overreach had provided. By escalating his harassment to such extreme levels, he had forced me to recognize patterns of behavior I might otherwise have continued to rationalize or excuse. Tomorrow, I would begin planning my return to New York, not as Marcus Richardson's estranged wife seeking sympathy for her failed marriage, but as Sarah Richardson, a professional art therapist with valuable expertise and hard-won insights into recovery from systematic emotional abuse. The woman who would return to Manhattan bore little resemblance to the one who had fled from Bernardin 6 weeks earlier. She was stronger, more perceptive, and completely unwilling to accept anyone's definition of her worth except her own. Marcus had spent considerable time and energy trying to destroy my reputation and credibility. Now I would have the opportunity to show everyone exactly what he had been so desperate to hide. A competent, stable woman whose only crime had been trusting someone who used that trust as a weapon against her. The prospect no longer seemed daunting. Instead, it felt like the beginning of the life I was meant to live once I stopped trying to fit into someone else's script for who I should be. 6 months later, I stood in my new office overlooking Washington Square Park, watching graduate students hurry across the campus of NYU, where I had just accepted a position as Director of Art Therapy Services. The space was mine, filled with my books, my artwork, and the kind of natural light that made everything seem possible. My secretary knocked and entered with a stack of applications. "The new trauma recovery program is completely booked," she announced with satisfaction. "We have a waiting list of over 200 clients." The success of my practice still surprised me sometimes. After returning to New York, I had discovered that Marcus's harassment campaign had backfired spectacularly. Word of his courtroom humiliation had spread quickly through Manhattan's legal community, and several of his former colleagues had quietly reached out to offer support and professional referrals. More importantly, the mental health professionals he had contacted with his false narrative had become some of my strongest advocates once they learned the truth. Dr. Martinez had not only provided glowing references, but had helped me secure the university position that had transformed my career. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Saw the Times article about your program. Mom would be so proud." The New York Times feature had been unexpected but welcome validation. The journalist had interviewed several of my clients, all women recovering from emotionally abusive relationships, and had written a compelling piece about the effectiveness of art therapy in processing trauma and rebuilding identity. The article had mentioned my own recovery from an abusive marriage only briefly, but that small reference had generated an avalanche of support from other survivors. My inbox was constantly filled with messages from women who recognized their own experiences in my story and found hope in my professional success. Through the window, I could see the building where Marcus had once worked. Coleman, Wright Associates had quietly asked for his resignation after the protective order became public record. The legal community was small and gossipy, and Marcus's spectacular courthouse defeat had damaged his reputation irreparably. I had heard through mutual acquaintances that his relationship with Victoria had ended badly when she discovered the extent of his manipulation tactics during our divorce. Apparently, she had assumed his version of our marital problems until Catherine provided her with documentation of his harassment campaign. Victoria had returned to New York alone, while Marcus remained in Los Angeles, working for a much smaller firm at a fraction of his former salary. The poetic justice of his professional downfall no longer gave me the satisfaction I had once imagined it would. Marcus had become irrelevant to my daily happiness, a cautionary tale from my past rather than a source of ongoing anger or resentment. My assistant announced my next appointment, a young woman named Lisa, whose story bore disturbing similarities to my own. She entered my office tentatively, carrying a small canvas she had painted during our last session. "I finished it," she said, setting the artwork on my desk. The painting showed a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, its wings still wet, but brilliantly colored against a dark background. "Tell me about the colors you chose," I said, settling into the chair across from her. "The darkness is everything I thought was normal," Lisa explained. "The butterfly is who I'm becoming now that I understand the difference between love and control." Working with clients like Lisa had taught me that my own experience with Marcus, painful as it had given me insights that made me uniquely effective at helping other women recognize and escape similar patterns. The manipulation tactics that had once seemed subtle and confusing were now transparently obvious to me. As our session concluded, Lisa gathered her materials with a confidence that hadn't been there when we first met. "Dr. Richardson, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever regret leaving him, even though you know it was right?" The question was one I heard frequently from clients struggling with the decision to leave abusive partners. They wanted reassurance that the pain and disruption would eventually be worth the freedom they might gain. "Never," I answered honestly. "The worst day of my new life has been better than the best day of trying to be someone else's version of perfect." Lisa smiled and left my office with the purposeful stride of someone who had found her answer. That evening, I walked through the village to my apartment, a cozy 2-bedroom space that reflected my actual taste, rather than someone else's idea of appropriate decor. The walls were covered with artwork from my clients, and pieces I had created myself during the therapeutic process of rebuilding my identity. I paused at a cafe that had become a regular stop, ordering my usual coffee and settling at a window table to review client notes for the next day. The simple pleasure of making choices based on my own preferences rather than anticipating someone else's expectations still felt revolutionary. "Sarah?" I looked up to see Jennifer Matthews, a former colleague from my graduate program who had followed my professional journey with interest. "I just read about your new book deal," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "A memoir about recovery from emotional abuse? That's incredibly brave." The book contract had been another unexpected development. An editor had read the Times article and approached me about writing a comprehensive guide to recognizing and recovering from coercive control. The project excited and terrified me in equal measure, requiring me to revisit the darkest period of my marriage while potentially helping thousands of other women in similar situations. "It feels like a responsibility more than a choice," I admitted. "So many women have reached out to share their stories, and they all thought they were alone in what they experienced. That's exactly why the book is necessary. You're showing them that manipulation isn't love, that control isn't care, and that leaving is possible even when it seems impossible." Jennifer's words echoed feedback I had received from countless other sources. My story had resonated not because it was unusual, but because it was devastatingly common. The specific details of Marcus's behavior were familiar to thousands of women who had gradually surrendered their independence to partners who claimed to love them while systematically undermining their autonomy. We talked for another hour about the book project, my expanded clinical practice, and the scholarship program I was developing for women seeking art therapy training after leaving abusive relationships. As Jennifer prepared to leave, she paused with a thoughtful expression. "Can I tell you something? I remember meeting Marcus at professional events during your marriage, and even then, something felt off about how he talked about you. He was always positioning himself as your protector or interpreter, explaining your thoughts and feelings to other people." Her observation validated perceptions I had suppressed during my marriage. Even people who knew us casually had sensed the unhealthy dynamics Marcus worked so hard to disguise as devotion and care. Walking home through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed. The woman who had entered Le Bernardin expecting an anniversary celebration would barely recognize the person I had become, not just professionally successful, but genuinely content with my own company, confident in my perceptions, and completely uninterested in romantic relationships that required me to diminish myself for someone else's comfort. My phone rang with Emma's contact information, our weekly check-in call that had become a treasured routine. "How are you feeling about the book deadline?" she asked without preamble. Nervous but determined. It's strange writing about Marcus objectively rather than defensively. I can see patterns now that were completely invisible when I was living them. That distance is probably what makes your perspective so valuable. You're not writing from a place of fresh trauma, but from a place of integrated understanding. Emma's insight was accurate. The book wasn't a bitter exposé of Marcus's behavior, but an analytical examination of how intelligent, educated women could gradually lose themselves in relationships with manipulative partners. I was writing for the woman I had been, the one who thought she was choosing love when she was actually accepting systematic control. After ending our call, I settled into my home office to work on the manuscript. The chapter I was drafting focused on the aftermath of leaving, the mixture of terror and exhilaration that comes with reclaiming autonomy after years of having decisions made for you. As I wrote, I thought about Lisa and my other clients, women at various stages of recognizing and escaping manipulative relationships. Their courage in facing the truth about their circumstances, in choosing uncertainty over familiar dysfunction, reminded me daily why my work mattered. The book's final chapter would focus on the unexpected gifts that emerged from surviving emotional abuse. Enhanced intuition about people's motives, deeper appreciation for authentic relationships, and unshakable confidence in one's own perceptions. The woman who had walked out of Le Bernardin in shocked devastation had been transformed into someone who trusted herself completely and refused to accept anyone else's definition of her worth. At midnight, I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, glancing at the framed photograph on my bedside table. It showed me at the Times Square art therapy workshop I had organized for domestic violence survivors, surrounded by women holding paintings they had created to represent their journey toward freedom. The faces in that photograph told the real story of recovery from abuse. Not bitter victims nursing permanent wounds, but vibrant women who had transformed their pain into purpose, their survival into strength. Tomorrow would bring new clients, progress on the book manuscript, and continued development of programs that helped other women recognize their own worth. The future stretched ahead, filled with possibilities I was free to explore, without asking anyone's permission or adapting to anyone else's expectations. Marcus had intended his calculated cruelty at Le Bernardin to destroy my confidence and force me into accepting his terms. Instead, he had accidentally provided the shock I needed to recognize the systematic control I had been accepting as love. The woman who had emerged from that wreckage bore little resemblance to the accommodating wife who had entered that restaurant. She was stronger, wiser, and completely unwilling to settle for relationships that required her to become smaller, rather than encouraging her to grow. And she was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.